Picture a cocktail party. It's just a completely standard Friday night gathering, right?
Got it. Just normal small talk.
Exactly. People are standing around, they're clutching their overpriced drinks, talking about the weather, maybe complaining about the commute.
Yeah, the usual stuff.
But now, I want you to imagine that standing over in the corner of this room is like the most brilliant, paradigm-shifting person of our generation.
Oh, okay.
A genius scientist whose work just fundamentally altered human genetics, or maybe some world-altering politician who just reshaped the global map.
The absolute top tier of visionaries.
Right. Now, picture them trying to navigate just 5 minutes of casual conversation at this party.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a painful image.
It's agonizing, right? The agonizing silences, the painfully inappropriate comments, they just have this absolute inability to read the room.
They really do.
And it brings up this huge question. Why is it that the exact cognitive wiring required to break the mold of history seems to make a person entirely incapable of functioning at a normal dinner party?
Well, it's actually one of the most persistent paradoxes in human psychology.
I mean, we expect them to be good at everything, don't
We
we?
do. We
Yeah.
have this culturally ingrained expectation that our visionaries should be, perfect across the board. Like, a genius in the lab should also be a charismatic leader and a super socially adept friend.
But that's just not how it works.
No, historical reality and increasingly our understanding of neurology suggests the exact opposite.
Right.
The cognitive framework required to see the world completely differently often, well, it inherently precludes the ability to participate in it normally.
And that profound disconnect is exactly what we are getting into today on this deep dive.
It's a big one.
It is a massive and, frankly, highly provocative deep dive for you today. We are pulling apart a video interview titled, "The West is Having an Autistic Meltdown."
Quite the title.
Yeah, it features Professor Ed Dutton in conversation with interviewer Andrew Gold.
And our mission here is really to explore the intersection of neurodivergence, specific personality traits, and extreme political movements.
We're going to unpack how certain psychological profiles don't just shape individual genius, but actually provide the underlying hardware for these massive purity spirals.
The ones we're currently watching tear through both far left and far right politics.
Exactly. But before we delve into the mechanics of this, we really must offer a crucial disclaimer to you, the listener.
Yes, this is very important.
The material we're analyzing today wades into incredibly controversial political and social waters. I mean, Dutton and Gold touch on race, gender identity, the medicalization of neurodivergence, deep partisan divides.
All the third rail topics.
Right. So we want to be completely explicit here. We are not taking a side.
Absolutely.
We are not endorsing, nor are we condemning the sociological or political views presented in this source material.
Our sole mission is to impartially break down the psychological and historical arguments exactly as they were laid out by the speakers.
We're just looking at the architecture of these ideas, not campaigning for them.
Precisely.
So with that firmly established, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
The entire argument in this video starts with a foundational premise about autism, and it specifically attacks a massive public misconception.
Yeah, the empathy misconception.
Right. I think a lot of people, when they encounter someone who's incredibly blunt or just socially detached, they casually equate autistic traits with psychopathic traits.
It's a really common colloquial assumption. People think, oh, they're being rude. They just don't care about other people's feelings.
But Dutton's framework...
Yes. The crucial distinction he draws right at the outset is between emotional empathy and cognitive empathy.
Okay, break that down for us.
If we don't separate those two, the rest of his theory regarding politics and history just won't make sense. Dutton points out that autistic individuals actually possess very high emotional empathy.
So they aren't psychopathic.
Not at all. They are not devoid of feeling. If they know you're physically hurt or if you explicitly tell them they have deeply upset you, they genuinely care.
Right.
It actually causes them deep distress to know another person is in pain.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
If they have high emotional empathy and they genuinely don't want to hurt people, why did they so often say the blunt, hurtful thing? I mean, I'm missing the disconnect there.
Because of cognitive empathy, or what psychologists refer to as theory of mind.
Okay.
This is the mechanism that allows you to intuitively understand how other people think. It's like that invisible subconscious radar most people have running in the background all the time.
So like reading the room.
Exactly. When you walk into a room, your brain is instantly translating Micro-expressions, shifts in body language, social contexts.
All the unwritten cultural rules.
Right, it translates all that into a behavioral map.
Yeah.
You intuitively know, my boss is tense, I shouldn't bring up the budget right now.
And an autistic person lacks that intuitive map.
Yes. They aren't purposely ignoring the social rules to be cruel. They literally cannot perceive the invisible rules that dictate politeness over blunt truth.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
They literally lack the software to simulate your mental state.
Exactly. And to give this some structure, Dutton references a psychological model by Simon Baron-Cohen.
Right, the systematizing versus empathizing brain.
Yes, it categorizes brains on a spectrum. Because an autistic individual struggles with that intuitive social radar, they aren't just socially awkward.
They're taking in a tidal wave of information. Right.
A completely overwhelming, unfiltered tidal wave of sensory and social data. The world feels deeply unpredictable and chaotic to them.
And to survive that tidal wave, without having a terrifying, chaotic meltdown, their brain is forced to adapt.
Right, it has to obsessively structure, categorize, and order their environment.
What's fascinating here is how that extreme systematizing becomes a vital defense mechanism against the chaos.
It really is. I mean, if human behavior feels like a terrifying random variable, you look for rigid rules. You look for absolute mathematical truths, highly controllable systems to anchor your reality.
And this brings us to a concept mentioned in the interview that I just absolutely loved. It was originally coined by evolutionary psychologist Bruce Charlton.
Yes. The head girl and the genius.
Yes. Distinguishing between two specific types of high achievers. This framework clarified so much for me about how we view success.
It's a great model.
So picture the head girl. She is brilliant. She gets top marks in every single subject.
She achieves all the socially approved goals.
Right. She volunteers for the right charities. She's perfectly adapted to the system. But because her brain is so perfectly optimized to follow the existing rules and read the social room,
she rarely produces truly revolutionary original thoughts.
Exactly. Dutton uses this great artistic analogy. He says, if the current socially rewarded trend is painting religious art, the head girl will paint the most technically flawless religious art in the gallery.
But she will never, ever be a Picasso.
No, she will never invent cubism.
Because inventing cubism requires a fundamental willingness to break the established rules of perspective.
Right.
It requires looking at the social consensus of what constitutes good art and completely disregarding it.
Which the head girl just can't do.
No, she is constitutionally wired to respect the consensus. The genius, on the other hand, is highly original, but deeply, fundamentally unbalanced.
Think about that for a second. It immediately reminded me of building a character in an old-school role-playing video game.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
You know the ones, right? You're building your character, and the game gives you exactly 100 skill points to distribute across your stats.
Right. Strength, intelligence, charisma.
Exactly. So the head girl looks at the stats and spreads them out perfectly evenly. She puts 20 points in intelligence, 20 in charisma, 20 physical agility, 20 in emotional regulation, and so on.
So she's well-rounded. She can handle any standard quest the game throws at her.
Exactly. But the genius takes 99 of those points and dumps them all into one highly specific, hyper-focused skill.
Like radical mathematical intelligence.
Yes. And then leaves exactly 1 point for basic life survival.
It is a profound trade-off. Because cognitive resources, both in video games and in human neurology, are finite.
You only get 100 points.
Right. And the interview highlights the DNA scientist James Watson as a prime real-world example of this extreme stat distribution.
Now, this part was wild.
Watson possessed massive linguistic and mathematical intelligence. He literally possessed the mental bandwidth to unravel the double helix structure of human DNA.
Which fundamentally changed biology forever.
But his spatial intelligence and fine motor skills were so profoundly low that he physically struggled to peel an orange.
Wow.
He had trouble doing up the buttons on his own shirt. He could never learn to drive a car.
It's an absurd contrast when you say it out loud.
It really is. And the interview notes that other towering intellectuals, like Enoch Powell and the philosopher A.J. Ayer, also never managed to learn to drive.
You can map the blueprint of human existence, but the spatial logic of parallel parking a sedan completely defeats you.
Exactly.
It's as if nature gives you this unparalleled brilliance in one highly specific domain, but absolutely bankrupts you in another.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, This unbalanced stat distribution doesn't just create eccentric scientists who need help with their buttons.
Right, it goes way beyond the lab.
It has profound implications for how our society operates, because these are the exact cognitive traits that push people to the very fringes of our political and media landscapes.
This is the underlying psychology of the radical rule breaker.
Yes.
So let's dig into that recipe for radicalism.
Yeah.
Because Dutton lists a very specific psychological profile for the kind of person who is willing to actively question or even destroy the established system.
He uses the big 5 personality traits for this.
Right, and he points to 3 in particular: low agreeableness, low conscientiousness, and high neuroticism.
Unpacking those is critical. Let's start with low conscientiousness. This essentially translates to low rule following.
Okay.
A highly conscientious person wants to pay their taxes on time, color inside the lines, respect authority.
Like the head girl.
Exactly. A low conscientiousness person doesn't inherently respect the established way of doing things just because it is a tradition.
They don't care about the rules.
Right. Then you add high neuroticism, which involves a baseline of anxiety, emotional volatility, and constant rumination.
So their mind is just always turning things over.
Always searching for a pattern to alleviate their internal unease.
And then the catalyst: low agreeableness, which, as we discussed with the autism framework, is often an accidental disagreeableness, right?
Yes, exactly. They aren't waking up deciding to be antagonistic.
They just prioritize their perceived truth over social harmony.
Because they don't feel the emotional weight of the social cost.
Precisely. When you combine those 3, the refusal to follow rules, the anxious rumination searching for new answers, and the complete disregard for social niceties, you get an individual who will happily present a disruptive, offensive new idea.
Regardless of whose career it ruins, including their own.
But, the interview also explores a different kind of outsider. One driven less by accidental autism and more by something actively antagonistic.
Yes, the dark triad traits.
Right. During their conversation, the interviewer, Andrew Gold, shares a very candid personal story.
It was quite revealing.
He admits that earlier in his career, he pitched himself to host mainstream media television programs. And he felt deeply qualified. He speaks multiple languages.
But he was rejected.
He claims he was explicitly rejected because the networks told him they were not hiring white men for those specific presenting gigs.
And Dutton's psychological analysis of Gold's reaction is very sharp here.
I found Gold's reaction to be the most revealing part of the whole exchange. A highly agreeable, highly conscientious head girl type might have been crushed by that rejection, right?
They would have accepted that this is just the current industry priority and quietly found a different career path.
But Gold's reaction was essentially, how dare they do this to me? If you won't let me play in your sandbox, I will build my own entirely new ecosystem.
And he went on to create a highly successful alternative media channel on YouTube.
Right. And Dutton suggests that building a rival empire out of spite doesn't point to the autistic systematizing brain.
No, it points to elevated dark triad traits.
Okay, let's define that for the listener, because dark triad sounds like a villain group in a comic book.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like in everyday life?
The dark triad refers to 3 specific personality traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism.
Okay, so how does that apply here?
In this context, Dutton is specifically pointing to mild narcissism, an inflated sense of self-importance, and a refusal to be a victim combined with Machiavellianism.
And Machiavellianism is?
It's that cold strategic calculus where you stop seeing people as humans with feelings and start seeing them as chess pieces. Pieces to be moved, manipulated, or bypassed to achieve your goal. It is the strategic ruthlessness to say, I will dismantle your game. Dutton argues that the modern alternative media landscape and fringe political movements in general are heavily populated by individuals who score higher in these dark triad traits.
So it's the fuel for countercultural ambition.
Exactly.
Which naturally leads us to a really thorny issue they debate in the video: the modern concept creep of neurodivergence.
This is a huge topic right now.
Because suddenly, especially online, everybody seems to want the label. Being neurodivergent has transitioned from a clinical diagnosis into this trendy identity marker.
It's become a way to gain instant social credit.
Right. Young people are claiming it because they want that genius aesthetic we were just talking about,
They want to be viewed as the edgy, super intelligent rule breaker who sees through the matrix.
without having to deal with any of the crippling realities that actually accompany the clinical condition.
It is a textbook example of the commodification of a medical diagnosis.
The interview recounts a very telling conversation, didn't it?
Yes, with a teenager who proudly claimed to be neurodivergent, utilizing it almost like a badge of honor to signify being special.
But then reality hit.
Exactly. When the adult gently reminded this teenager that their specific struggles, like their complete inability to comfortably sit, make eye contact, and hold a reciprocal conversation at a family dinner table, were the actual unglamorous symptoms of that condition.
The teenager got mad.
Incredibly angry and defensive. They wanted the cultural cachet of the label, the cool factor of being different, but aggressively rejected the behavioral reality of the disorder.
I'm really struggling to square this trend with the harm it causes.
It's very harmful.
I mean, if our modern grievance hierarchy rewards having an ism or a condition, are we actively diluting the very real, debilitating struggles of actual autism?
That's exactly the risk.
The interview mentions someone whose life is absolute hell simply because they process everyday noise the way a cat does.
Right, severe sensory overload.
If every quirky teenager on TikTok claims the label for internet clout because they occasionally get distracted, doesn't that mask the person who is literally paralyzed by the sound of a refrigerator humming in the next room?
It raises an important question about the utility and the danger of expanding diagnoses.
Because originally it was meant to help, right?
Exactly. Originally, expanding the diagnostic criteria for autism was an act of profound empathy. The goal was to ensure people who didn't fit the classic extreme nonverbal profile could still get therapeutic help and workplace accommodations.
But when it gets diluted,
When the criteria becomes so diluted that the label becomes a mere social accessory, it completely masks the profound suffering of those at the extreme end of the spectrum.
they just get left behind.
Utterly isolated. Because their severe, unglamorous reality doesn't match the sanitized, trendy version of neurodivergence that is popularized and celebrated online.
So if this absolute refusal to read the room and follow the rules gets you fired from a media job or makes you a pariah at school, what happens when that exact same psychological profile is handed the levers of global power?
That is the million-dollar question.
Does that stubbornness suddenly become a superpower?
This is where Dutton's theories scale up from individual psychology to macro history. He introduces the concept of the autistic savior.
Okay, the autistic savior. How does that work?
It works like this. In times of peace, prosperity, and societal stability, the public wants the head girl manager.
Right, the person who plays by the rules.
They want a smooth, highly agreeable, conscientious administrator who keeps the bureaucratic machinery running quietly and doesn't offend anyone.
But in a crisis,
In times of severe societal collapse, war, or economic ruin, when the existing rules have clearly failed, the public psychology shifts.
they don't want the head girl anymore.
Suddenly, they crave a rule breaker. They need someone who is entirely unbothered by offending the establishment because the establishment is what led to the crisis.
The interview points to Winston Churchill as a prime historical example here.
Yes, a classic example.
He supposedly possessed many traits that align with this neurodivergent profile.
He did. He had an intense sensory sensitivity to certain fabrics and materials.
And he hated authority.
A lifelong, almost pathological habit of questioning military authority, which got him into massive trouble early in his career.
And he had this ability to mask his own deep anxieties with a persona of supreme, almost irrational confidence.
Which is exactly what you need in a crisis. When bombs are literally falling on London and the entire continent is collapsing, you don't want a polite consensus builder who wants to find a compromise with the enemy.
You want someone so systemically stubborn that they simply refuse to compute the logic of surrender.
Churchill's inability to accept the socially obvious reality that Britain was outmatched became his greatest asset.
But the interview goes even deeper into a more recent and highly polarizing historical figure.
Margaret Thatcher.
Right. Drawing on a book called Accidental Feminist, the argument is made that Thatcher revolutionized British politics precisely because she operated on an autistic cognitive framework.
The breakdown of Thatcher in this context was fascinating.
It really was. The author of that book suggests Thatcher had a profound, almost clinical hyperfocus
Her entire worldview was aggressively narrowed down.
to essentially two obsessive interests, conservative politics and nice clothes, perhaps chocolates.
Right. The entire rest of the human experience, art, pop culture, complex emotional family dynamics, was just filtered out as irrelevant noise.
And her poor theory of mind, her absolute lack of cognitive empathy, was actually her ultimate superpower at the beginning of her career.
The interview details how she was notably distant from her own children.
Which is wild. And more shockingly, she openly and brazenly married an older, wealthy man, Dennis Thatcher, purely because he was a highly useful financial asset for her political ambitions.
And we know this isn't historical speculation.
No, because she wrote unapologetic, highly practical letters to her sister detailing this exact utility.
She wasn't agonizing over romantic love or societal expectations of marriage. She was systematizing her ascent to power.
For a politician, treating people purely as utility functions on a spreadsheet can be brutally effective.
It gave her what the interview describes as a weird innocence.
A weird innocence. I like that phrasing.
She could cut through decades of entrenched bureaucratic red tape and establish political pleasantries because she simply didn't perceive the social cost of her actions.
She was black and white in her economic convictions.
During the massive union strikes and economic crisis of the late 70s, that rigid, unyielding structure was incredibly attractive to a chaotic, frightened public.
And this is the classic tragedy of this specific psychological profile. The exact trait that allows the leader to build the empire is the exact trait that eventually burns it down.
It's the double-edged sword.
While a poor theory of mind allows a leader to be an effective, unyielding bulldozer initially, it eventually isolates and destroys them.
Because the bulldozer gets stuck and they can't understand why the ground shifted.
Precisely. The core insight here is about the natural lifespan of radical leadership.
Thatcher's inability to read people eventually led to massive political hubris.
Because she couldn't intuitively sense the shifting, complex moods of her cabinet colleagues or the general public.
Right. She slowly surrounded herself with sycophants who only told her that her systems were brilliant. She lost her anchor to human reality.
This culminated in the poll tax disaster.
A policy that made perfect mathematical sense in a purely systematized worldview, but was a catastrophic failure of understanding human emotion and fairness.
Her inability to read the room led to her eventual betrayal and ousting by her own party. She lacked the managerial, empathetic counterpart to balance her extreme systematizing.
Exactly.
Thinking about Thatcher's trajectory, I immediately thought of Elon Musk, who's actually mentioned briefly in the source material.
Yes, the parallels are strong.
Musk is a self-proclaimed autistic visionary. He has completely disrupted the automotive and aerospace industries using radical systematizing logic.
But now, holding immense digital and cultural power with X, formerly Twitter, he operates with virtually zero accountability.
It reminds me of brilliant but incredibly erratic actors or comedians like Robin Williams or Jim Carrey.
How so?
Well, their absolute best, most generation-defining work only happened when they had a strict traditional director holding the reins, shaping their chaotic genius into a consumable narrative.
That is a highly clarifying analogy. A visionary desperately needs a manager.
Right, they need a grounding force.
A John Major type, as the interview suggests regarding Thatcher. Someone highly conscientious to handle the bureaucracy, read the emotional temperature of the room, and tell the visionary, remember, you are mortal, and this policy will alienate half the country.
Without that director, the genius type is prone to making wildly impulsive decisions based purely on their own rigid internal logic.
Completely oblivious to the massive social fallout. When you remove all the guardrails from a mind that already struggles with cognitive empathy, the resulting decisions can be chaotic and destructive.
So we've looked at the isolated genius and the lone radical leader. But what happens when thousands of these anxious, chaotic, low-empathy minds find each other on the internet?
The purity spirals.
The interview makes a fascinating and highly controversial argument here. That the woke left and the woke right are not ideological opposites, but are actually operating on the exact same psychological hardware.
This is where Dutton synthesizes psychology and modern politics.
And it's explosive.
He posits that individuals who feel profound internal chaos and existential anxiety are naturally drawn to the rigid, uncompromising structure of political extremes.
It gives them what they need.
The extreme group provides them with an instant prepackaged identity and a perfectly clear set of rules for how the world works.
He outlines 5 specific pillars of extremism, right?
Yes, 5 pillars that are cognitively identical, regardless of whether you are looking at far-left progressivism or far-right nationalism.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of these 5 pillars,
Yeah.
because this is where the mirror really gets held up to modern internet culture.
Pillar number 1 is dogmatism.
Unyielding, absolute definitions.
Exactly. On the right, the interview uses the example of a rigid, purely genetic definition of what constitutes Englishness.
And on the left.
It points to absolute, unyielding definitions of modern gender or intersectional identity theories. There is zero room for nuance.
But why? Why does the extremist mind crave that rigidity?
Because nuance requires cognitive empathy and tolerance for ambiguity.
Right.
If your brain is fundamentally anxious and overwhelmed by a complex, rapidly changing society, ambiguity feels like a physical threat.
So dogmatism is a psychological life raft.
Precisely. If Englishness is purely a genetic mathematical equation, or if oppression can be mapped on a rigid intersectional chart, the anxiety disappears. The world is ordered.
Which explains why Pillar 2 is so aggressive. The dismissal of empirical evidence.
Yes.
If data contradicts the ideology, the data is not just questioned, it is aggressively ignored or deemed literal heresy.
The interview uses the example of the far right completely denying statistical data regarding Ashkenazi Jewish IQ scores.
Because acknowledging that data would conflict with their overarching racial worldview. But why does data cause such a violent reaction?
It's the friction of cognitive dissonance. For the extremists, the ideology is not just a political preference, it is the structural foundation of their mental stability.
So if you break the ideology,
If you present empirical evidence that cracks that foundation, you are not just winning a debate, you are threatening to plunge them back into the terrifying chaos they joined the extreme group to escape.
therefore the data must be destroyed.
It has to be.
That makes Pillar 3, purity signaling, make so much sense. This is the competitive element of extremism, isn't it?
Yes, the arms race.
It's not enough to quietly believe the cause. You have to constantly prove to the in-group that you are the most dedicated, the most radical. It's an arms race to the absolute fringe.
Purity signaling is an evolutionary survival mechanism within the group.
How so?
Because extreme groups are inherently paranoid and constantly hunting for infiltrators, you must constantly demonstrate your fanaticism to avoid being targeted yourself.
You adopt the most extreme vernacular.
You promote the most radical policies simply to signal, I am safe, do not attack me.
And when someone does step out of line, we hit Pillar 4, emotional attacks.
The purge.
When challenged, the response from the extreme fringe isn't a logical debate about policy. It is an immediate, visceral labeling of the outsider as a traitor, a fascist, or an enemy.
That is the amygdala hijacking the conversation. It is a protective reflex.
By immediately labeling the opponent as morally evil.
You absolve yourself of the responsibility to engage with their intellectual argument. You don't have to debate a monster, you just have to destroy them. It maintains the purity of the in-group's worldview.
And finally, Pillar 5, grievance identity.
This is key.
This is when wallowing in victimhood becomes the absolute core of your personality. Your identity is entirely dependent on being oppressed by a vast external systemic force.
Without the grievance, they have no identity.
And looking at these 5 pillars together, it prompted a massive question for me.
What's that?
The interview mentioned specific instances of women flipping from far-left, radical student union politics to far-right, traditional Catholicism in the span of just 10 years.
A total 180.
They went from one end of the spectrum to the exact opposite. Does this prove that for these specific individuals, the actual content of the politics doesn't matter at all?
That's a profound question.
Is it purely about the psychological relief of having a rigid black and white identity to cling to?
That is precisely the implication Dutton is making. The political ideology, whether it is radical Marxism or ultra-traditional religion, is merely the vessel.
The true driver is the psychological need to quell internal anxiety with absolute certainty.
Exactly. If you suffer from an unstable sense of self, a dogmatic, extreme community offers an incredibly seductive cure.
They tell you exactly who you are.
They tell you exactly who the enemy is, and they give you a rule book for exactly how to behave. The relief of that certainty is intoxicating, regardless of the political flavor.
But even within those highly structured, extreme worldviews, human nature always seems to make things messy.
It always does.
The interview explores this vulnerability beautifully with the concept of Englishness. Dutton outlines this idea of concentric circles of genetic similarity.
Right, your immediate family, your cousins, your extended ethnic group.
It's a very clinical, systematized, almost biological view of human bonding.
Yet, even the source material admits that human emotion and social bonding constantly defy strict mathematical genetics.
They use the brilliant example of the beloved British boxer Frank Bruno.
Yes. By a strict, dogmatic, far-right genetic definition, he wouldn't fit the concentric circles of historical Englishness.
But culturally, the group entirely adopts him.
They say, he fought for our country, he embraces our culture, he made us proud, he is definitively one of us.
Emotion, shared cultural narrative, and genuine human affection completely override the rigid genetic ideology.
It shows that even the most hyper-systematizing minds eventually have to yield to the messy reality of human connection. The mathematical model breaks down when faced with genuine affection.
And just to show you how provocative Dutton's thought process gets when trying to systematize these messy issues, he jokingly suggests a primary school draft system for immigration.
A literal draft.
He proposes a scenario where everyone with ancestors in the country before 1948 gets to nominate 2 people to stay, like picking teams for dodgeball.
We mention this strictly as an example of how his mind works.
Creating bizarre, highly structured, almost gamified systems to address incredibly complex, emotionally charged social issues.
It perfectly illustrates the systematizing brain in action. Taking a chaotic, deeply human issue like immigration and attempting to impose a rigid, albeit highly eccentric, mathematical rulebook upon it to regain a sense of control.
Okay, so if we want to prove that these purity spirals, these grievance identities, and this desperate need for extreme virtue signaling are not just inventions of the TikTok era.
We have to look at history.
Right, and the interview pivots to Dutton's most controversial historical argument, his book on the Quakers.
This is a fascinating historical case study. Dutton wrote a book titled The Quaker Question.
And he openly admits in the interview that it was conceived almost entirely as a Straussian satire.
Yes.
We need to break that down for the listener. What exactly does a Straussian satire mean in this context?
Leo Strauss was a political philosopher who argued that writers living under oppressive regimes or operating in highly censored environments often hide their true controversial meanings beneath a surface-level historical narrative.
So they write in code.
Basically.
Yeah.
The interview references a German academic during WWII who desperately wanted to critique the Nazi regime, but doing so directly meant execution.
Obviously.
So he wrote a scathing, highly detailed critique of a violent, fanatic 16th century Protestant rebellion in the city of Münster.
Oh, that's clever.
To the censors, it was a history book. To his intellectual peers, everyone knew he was actually dissecting the psychology of the Nazis.
And Dutton employs a similar structural tactic here with the Quakers.
He takes the extreme right-wing anti-Semitic paranoia, the conspiracy theory that Jewish people are the grand subversives behind everything, and he meticulously applies that exact same paranoid framework to the Quakers.
He argues, satirically, but using real historical data, that the Quakers are the true subversive string pullers behind every major left-wing movement in history.
Women's suffrage, prison reform, anti-colonialism.
But the genius of the satire is that in attempting to mock conspiracy theorists, he actually uncovers a real, verified evolutionary survival strategy from the 17th century.
Yes, what he calls the evolutionary niche of the nice.
Okay, set the scene for this.
During the 1600s, Europe experienced a prolonged climatic event known as the Maunder Minimum.
It was a mini ice age.
Brutal, freezing winters, crop failures, and extreme societal hardship. Resources were incredibly scarce, and violence was high.
In this harsh environment, a fringe religious group has to find a way to survive and pass on their genes without being slaughtered by the majority.
The Quakers, who were largely excluded from mainstream political power, found a brilliant evolutionary niche.
Super virtue signaling.
Exactly. They survived by being the most conspicuously pious, utterly harmless people in the room.
They refused to take off their hats in court, showing deference to God over the judge.
They insisted on using formal thee and thou language to authority figures to show equality. They embraced absolute pacifism.
They actively invited physical punishment and imprisonment to prove to the public how genuinely virtuous and unyielding they were.
And from a purely evolutionary and economic standpoint, it worked flawlessly.
By signaling extreme trustworthiness, pacifism, and honesty, they gained the ultimate trust of the wider non-Quaker community.
During a time of rampant fraud and instability, average people felt safe leaving their money with Quaker bankers.
Or doing business with Quaker merchants.
Because they were perceived as completely honest and non-threatening. Through this niche of hypermorality, they accumulated massive financial resources without ever having to lift a sword or fight for territory.
And the direct parallels Dutton draws between these 17th century Quakers and modern wokeness are jaw-dropping.
He points to historical precursors that perfectly mirror today's intense culture wars.
For instance, the interview mentions the universal friend,
A 17th century Quaker in Rhode Island.
who suffered a severe illness, had a radical conversion experience, and subsequently claimed to have died and been resurrected as a spirit that was neither man nor woman.
They would become visibly angry if addressed with gendered pronouns.
It is arguably the first recorded instance of a non-binary or transsexual religious leader in America, driven by the exact same psychological desire to transcend traditional societal categories.
The historical parallels continue heavily into their protest tactics, too.
Oh, the naked protests.
Yes, the source describes a Quaker practice literally called going naked as a sign.
In the 1650s, Quaker women would strip entirely naked and storm into Anglican services in places like Westminster Hall to disrupt the sermons.
They were protesting what they saw as the profound religious corruption of the state church, claiming their nakedness represented a return to the moral innocence and perfection of Adam and Eve.
Dutton directly connects this 17th century shock tactic to modern activist groups like Feynman, who use topless protests to disrupt political summits today.
The psychological hardware of using extreme bodily vulnerability to shame the establishment hasn't changed in 400 years.
But the absolute core of it all, the engine driving this certainty, is the Quaker theology of the inner light.
That's just crucial.
This is the theological belief that God is literally in me. I have a direct, unmediated line to divine truth.
Dutton argues this is the ultimate form of theological narcissism.
Think about it. If you genuinely believe you are a direct vessel for absolute divine truth, you are completely insulated from any external pushback.
You can define your own reality.
And anyone who disagrees with you isn't just factually wrong or politically opposed, they are actively opposing the divine will.
It is the ultimate psychological shield against empirical evidence, which brings us right back to our pillars of extremism.
Pillar 2.
Right. If your truth comes from an unassailable, subjective inner light, you never have to compromise. Your subjective feeling is the objective fact.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Oh.
Because as I pointed out when we were reviewing this material, history is rarely as clean or cohesive as a psychological model wants it to be.
Fair point.
Yeah, I have a really hard time swallowing the purity of this narrative. It sounds incredibly cynical to reduce hundreds of years of genuine religious pacifism to an evolutionary grift to survive a cold winter.
It is a very clinical view.
And the interview itself acknowledges a massive contradiction. The banks. While Quakers were funding progressive, left-wing, subversive causes like the abolition of slavery, they were simultaneously founding massive, cornerstone financial institutions like Barclays and Gurney's that were heavily backing and profiting from the very slave trade they ideologically opposed.
It's a glaring paradox.
If a group is funding both the abolitionists and the slave ships, isn't this less about a grand, cohesive psychological conspiracy of virtue signaling and more about standard human hypocrisy?
It just seems like the messy, contradictory reality of a marginalized group trying to survive and accumulate power in high finance.
Exactly.
And that is the vital counterargument. When any group, marginalized or otherwise, achieves significant financial and institutional power, the ideological purity of their origins is almost always compromised by the brutal pragmatism of maintaining that power.
You can't stay pure forever.
Dutton's satire works to highlight the absurdity of grand conspiracy theories, whether applied to Jewish people, Quakers, or modern political cabals, by exposing the inherent messy contradictions within the groups themselves. A purely systematized view of history fails because humans are hypocrites.
And this conversation about extreme religious dissidence and ideological purity naturally begs the ultimate question.
What is the historical price of holding these fringe beliefs?
We've talked about the social cost of being the genius or the outsider today, getting rejected from a media job or getting publicly shamed on Twitter. But the interview brings up the visceral historical cost.
Yeah, I see.
This is the transition from the metaphorical purity spiral to the literal one.
The literal flames.
The interview recounts the harrowing story of Thomas Cranmer, a chief architect of the English Reformation.
When the Catholic Mary Tudor took the throne, Cranmer was condemned to burn at the stake for his Protestant beliefs.
It's an incredible, deeply haunting anecdote. Cranmer, in a moment of completely understandable human terror, facing a horrific death, cowardly signed a document recanting his Protestant faith, hoping Mary would spare his life.
But Mary, driven by her own extreme ideological purity, decided to burn him anyway.
And in his final moments, when he was tied to the stake and the fire was lit, Cranmer dramatically thrust his right hand, the exact hand that had signed the cowardly recantation, into the flames first,
He held it there.
letting it burn off before the fire consumed the rest of his body. He made a spectacular, gruesome public display of his own ultimate conviction.
And while we're discussing the grim reality of the stake, the interview provides a morbid but historically vital correction.
Oh, this part was wild.
We have this ingrained cultural image of heretics dying in prolonged screaming agony as the flames slowly consume them.
Like in the movies?
But the source notes that most people burned at the stake actually died of asphyxiation. They choked on the dense smoke long before the flames ever reached their vital organs. Furthermore, in many cases, sympathetic executioners, perhaps exhibiting some of that cognitive empathy we discussed earlier, would tie small bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck.
Wow.
When the flames rose high enough to ignite the powder, it would instantly blow their head off, mercifully sparing them the agony of the fire.
It's a deeply gruesome detail, but it grounds the history. It pulls it out of the realm of abstract theology and makes the physical cost of belief incredibly real.
If we connect this historical, visceral reality to the bigger psychological picture, it demonstrates the timeless, inherent danger of true originality.
To possess that neurodivergent genius.
To be that profoundly disagreeable person who refuses to follow the rules of the head girl means you will inevitably face the wrath of the mainstream.
The collective majority operates on consensus.
Modern heretics are no longer tied to wooden stakes with gunpowder around their necks. They are socially exiled, deplatformed, stripped of their livelihoods, and publicly shamed.
But the underlying psychological mechanism of the mob remains identical.
The collective will always seek to punish the individual who threatens the stability of their structured reality.
Wow. We have covered an immense, complex landscape today.
We really have.
Let's try to synthesize the journey we've just been on. We started by looking at the intricate, often deeply misunderstood wiring of the autistic mind, how a deficit in cognitive empathy forces a brain to obsessively systematize the world just to survive the incoming chaos.
We explored how that specific, unbalanced stat distribution can create world-altering leaders like Margaret Thatcher or Elon Musk.
Leaders who bulldoze through history because they ignore the social rules, but eventually risk collapsing under their own isolated hubris.
We then mapped how that exact same psychological hardware, the profound anxiety, the desperate need for rigid rules, the fear of ambiguity, drives the extreme purity spirals of both the woke left and the extreme right today.
The ideology is different, but the cognitive engine is the same.
And finally, we trace those behavioral patterns of purity signaling and grievance all the way back to the 17th century Quakers, surviving the harsh winters of the Maunder Minimum through extreme, almost weaponized virtue signaling.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What is the core, actionable takeaway from this massive historical and psychological map?
The core insight is a lens for viewing modern conflict.
Also,
Whether you are dealing with a difficult, obsessive colleague at work, watching a radical politician scream on the evening news, or doom-scrolling through furious, deeply tribal social media debates, you must remember that you are almost always watching psychology disguised as ideology.
right.
Behind the aggressive purity signaling, behind the rigid dogmatic definitions and the furious grievance, there is rarely a genuine intellectual debate occurring.
It's just an anxious mind.
A very anxious mind desperately crying out for order in an overwhelmingly chaotic world. The political ideology is just the armor they wear to protect themselves from the chaos.
The ideology is just the armor. That is a profound way to look at it. And that brings us to our final thought for today.
Something to mull over.
We want to leave you with a challenge that builds directly on everything we've just discussed. Think about the groups you belong to in your own life.
It could be your workplace, your chosen political party, your neighborhood association, or even just your closest circle of friends.
Look incredibly closely at the foundation of those relationships. Are you truly bonded together by a shared joy of creating something new?
Are you united by a positive, constructive goal?
Or, if you look really, really closely, are you actually just bonded by a shared grievance against an outsider? Because as we've learned today, the moment your identity relies on someone else being the villain, You might just be trapped in a purity spiral of your own making.
It is a diagnostic question that requires a great deal of cognitive empathy and deeply uncomfortable self-reflection to answer honestly.
It certainly is. Thank you for coming along on this incredibly deep dive with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.